As KwaZulu-Natal continues to battle an ongoing water crisis, there are people who are reported to be benefiting from this. Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Water and Sanitation revealing that there is a criminal syndicate termed water tanker mafias who are sabotaging the already struggling water infrastructure in order to cash in on the crisis. To help us understand this now a little bit better is Dr. Anthony Turton, a water scientist who's done some research on this so-called water tanker mafias. Dr. Turton, good evening to you and thank you for your time. Let's first understand whether these distressed municipalities across the country, whether they've become prime targets for criminal syndicates who've identified them as business opportunity.
Yes, good evening to you and the listeners. I've done quite a bit of work on the criminal elements of the water sector. And what we're seeing now is not only in KZN, you're seeing it across the country, that you're getting, on the one hand, a political activism that is linked to the damaging and destruction of parts of the water infrastructure. And we saw this happening as a prelude to the 2021 Looters' War, where there were very specific elements of the infrastructure that were targeted, and that suggested to me that there was a very intelligent decision-making process behind the scenes. And then we also saw it recently, a few months ago, in the political unrest and sort of blockade of Durban, eThekwini, where there were water meters that were actually sabotaged. So we've also seen it in other parts of the country where it's got a different manifestation. For example, we've seen it up in the Gauteng area, in the Pretoria area, around that wastewater works in Pretoria, where we had that cholera outbreak a while ago. You had a very, very big tanker mafia operating there. Yeah. And we also see in parts of the Free State, for example, where there's a sewage mafia, where the sewage mafia go and sabotage the sewers at very, very carefully predetermined areas, with the intention of then landing the emergency contracts to pump the sewage that's now flowing into commercial buildings, for example. Yeah. So this is happening. It's fairly well entrenched in South Africa at the moment.
Let's get to grips with the method or methods used by these syndicates. How is the municipal water infrastructure sabotaged?
Well, the first thing is you need to know that there are certain parts of the infrastructure that are more critical than the others. So to a certain extent, there has to be collaboration with an insider. And I think that's an important part of understanding this crime. It's there are definite political linkages to people in authority, and that needs additional investigation. What then happens is that critical elements are selected, and these are then damaged. And the purpose of that now is to create a crisis. And in fact, there's a very interesting relationship between the bigger the crisis and the bigger the opportunity to bypass the procurement process. And it all comes down to bypassing the procurement process, because if it wasn't a crisis, then there's no justification to bypass the normal procurement process. So The bigger the crisis there is, the bigger the opportunity is. And what then happens is the political insider now makes noise about how big this crisis is and how they justify why the procurement has to be bypassed, and then that is then fed out to the politically connected people that are now tendering for that job. So that's my understanding of it. It would obviously be more refined if there was a more sophisticated police investigation into these activities.
Let's understand how the communities who depend on the municipal water supply, how they are impacted by this.
Well, they're impacted in multiple ways. If you just take, for example, the wastewater, the sewage mafia, what they do is they put blockages down the sewers. They then cause the sewer to flow up to the surface. This is targeted in a specific area so that it causes maximum disruption, say, for example, to some commercial properties or something like that. And they then get the contract for pumping. And what the pumping does now is it simply takes the raw sewage from the sewer, and it then pumps it into the road. It pumps it into the nearest stormwater drain. And what that does is it pumps it into the nearest river. And that's one of the reasons why we've got such high E. coli counts in many of our rivers across the country. It's not necessarily only because of wastewater works dysfunction, it's also because of this type of activity. So, in other words, the criminal activity now bypasses the normal treatment, wastewater treatment process. That's the one thing that happens. And then the other thing that happens is that the normal drinking water services are disrupted. So we've seen, for example, in the Ugu district municipality, where specific valves were sabotaged. We've also seen it recently up in Johannesburg. Johannesburg Water, Rand Water had that case of that one particular valve that was shut off. Now these are classic examples of insider knowledge, knowing which critical piece of infrastructure can be turned on or off, or broken, or somehow brought out of service to create the maximum disruption. So we're seeing on the one hand the criminalization of this, or criminal activities, and on the other hand we see it potentially overlapping with political aspirations, where some of the political parties might seek to gain from creating the impression that government is not on top of this, or that government is creating a problem for its citizens. Yeah. So there's definitely a criminal element and there's also a political element, and those two overlap at different places.
So the bigger the crisis experienced, the bigger the opportunity, indeed.
That's it.
Where I want to get to, therefore, is how quickly does the municipality need to act in order to issue a water tanker tender? What processes are possibly bypassed in order for this tender to be out very quickly, because the community cannot be starved of water?
Yes, absolutely. So that's a perfect example of it. Now it gets interesting in the economics of the crime, because the tanker now has to get water from somewhere. So it would normally be required to get water from the municipal water supply, which is treated water. But it now has to stand in a queue, because there might be 10 or 20 of these tankers standing in a queue at a standpipe. Now the economics is as follows. The tanker fills up at the shortest possible time, then has to go and discharge its load. It often sells that load, even though it's not supposed to sell that load. But it gets paid for every load delivered. That's the important part. Every load delivered generates an invoice, which generates a payment. But now, if your tankers are standing in a queue of 10 or 20 tankers long, and you might only do one turnaround per day, what happens now is there's an incentive to bypass that. And what they then do is they then go and find an alternative water source. And that alternative water source could be a nearest river. They just pump river water into the tanker, pretending that this is actually potable water. And I believe that lies at the heart, potentially, of the cholera crisis up in Pretoria a short while ago. We haven't yet proven that, but this is the working hypothesis of that. I've certainly seen that happening in other parts of KZN. So, in other words, the economics have to be understood. The invoices are generated by the number of loads, the number of turnarounds. And if you've got a lot of vehicles waiting at a queue, then your invoice rate is low. So therefore, you incentivize now to bypass it. And this is now where the human health impact comes in, because people are now purchasing water that is not SANS 241 standard, and therefore there is a criminal enterprise involved. And I advise clients, for example, I do a lot of work in the residential estate community and what have you, and when they are forced to buy water from tankers or factories, some factories also buy water from tankers, what I do there is I recommend that they create a register in each case. And in that register, they must get the name of the driver, they must get the registration number of the driver, they must get all the details of the invoice and also of the water use license, if available, so that if there is in fact some or other human health crisis, that they can at least know who to follow up with, or they can at least have some information to hand over to the police. Yeah. So this is the important aspect.
Do communities know, Professor, that they're not supposed to buy this water from water tankers? It's supposed to be free water delivered to them.
Look, I can't speak on behalf of communities. I personally don't think that it's that well communicated. But having said that, when you're in crisis and when there's no water flowing and you've got to get your children off to school, or you have to get out to go and earn a living that day to put bread on the table, people haven't really got options. You must also appreciate that that one of the roles that I play is I'm the editor of a journal called Water Policy, which is the official journal of the World Water Council, and I'm responsible for Africa. So I often get stories like this crossing my desk. It's not only a South African phenomena. In fact, it's an African-wide phenomena. The emergence of vendors, water vendors. They capture a supply of water, and they then capitalize on that captured supply. So it's not in anyone's collective interest. And the good news is that the Minister and the Director General of Water Affairs have taken a very, very strong stance against this now. And I would like to give my full public support to these people. Because they are starting to come down now on the different municipalities that are dysfunctional, and they're starting to look at serious criminal charges that are being laid. So in other words, we must support our minister, we must support the DG in the work that they are doing, and the communities must also be very, very vigilant. They're not supposed to buy water that is supplied under emergency circumstances like that. That's the important thing.
While that call needs to be heeded, Dr. Turton, that the minister and his DG at Water and Sanitation must be supported, let's talk about the long-term consequences of this behavior, if not stopped by authorities.
I think the long-term consequence, we can look at what's happened to Eskom. That we believe anything that Adrian de Ruyter wrote about in his book, about the existence of various mafias that are embedded in Eskom. I think there's a very strong parallel here. We're seeing the same type of thing happening in the water sector. So, does it validate what de Ruyter said? I don't know. But certainly what I'm seeing is that this is definitely present out there. So what we need to do is we need to understand that water is an economic enabler. If people can't get access to water, then they can't function normally, they can't be healthy people. But more importantly, that water going through factories is creating jobs and employment opportunities. So when your factories start having this kind of problem, then you're going to start seeing the accelerated layoff of people, people losing their jobs. And some work that I've done is for some factories, for example, where they have now developed a plan B because of this water shedding a policy that the government has implemented. They've now developed, let's call it a coping strategy, whereby they've got contracts with some tanker operators. And I've warned them now as well, for example, exactly what I've said earlier on now about the need to get the registration number of the company and all that sort of stuff. Because at the end of the day, if there is some legal blowback, if somebody does get sick, if there is cholera in the water that has been purchased from a tanker operator, and you are producing a product with that water, then of course there's all sorts of legal liabilities. So now the bottom line is we're seeing the criminalization of the water sector, and that is not in anyone's collective best interest. This is like a cancer that will eventually so degrade the quality of the system that eventually it'll be very, very difficult to get it going once again. In other words, job losses and economic stagnation is very, very likely as a direct result of this if we don't turn it around.
Very dire warning there. Thank you very much for your time and insight, Dr. Anthony Turton, a water scientist.